Good morning. Now, continuing with Dr. Inkster.
Yes, please, Mark.
Good morning, Dr. Inkster. Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Inkster, what I'd like to do is go back to Bundle 14, Volume 2, to the Hoffman email, which is page 140. So we talked about a later section of this about aerolization yesterday, but I didn't take you to the final email from Mr. Hoffman at the top of the page. So what do you take it that he's saying in the final reply to you at 10:12 on the 16th?
So, two things. So the first one, I absolutely agree with that whatever is in the drains is on a one-way route. So the key there is making sure that the drains are free-flowing and that's all going in, the correct direction and there's nothing coming back up into the sink. What he is saying to me in the second paragraph, I believe he feels that air changes are irrelevant and they are not in fact about dilution. They are more about comfort, temperature and odour control, and that they're not relevant to preventing infection.
Now, in what context is this, is the first thing? So is this in a discussion about Ward 6A?
It's a discussion about Ward 2A and Ward 6A because we were concerned about aerosolisation from drains. Obviously, Ward 2A had chilled beams, reduced air changes. I was concerned about the dilution of contaminants, and we were moving patients to a similar setting in Ward 6A with the same chilled beams, albeit the drains were not in the same condition.
If that's your understanding of what he said, and I get the impression he might have said the same thing roughly in his evidence a few years ago, it seems clear from the IMT minutes we looked at before that you didn't report this back to the IMT. Is that correct?
I can't recall without looking at the minutes, but possibly not.
Well, let's go and look at the IMT minutes. That's Bundle 1, document 38. So this is the 14th of September IMT.
Mr. McIntosh, could we go back to the email? I appreciate we've had Mr. Hoffman's evidence, but can you just see what he's saying?
So what he's saying, my lord, is page 140 of Bundle 1, Bundle 14 of Volume 1, is that there's nothing special about chilled beams, and then he just explains why. He then talks about, he then says in the third line, for their rooms, all of them need to be passed through a HEPA filter. Now, were there HEPA filters in Ward 6A?
No.
And the rooms should be at positive pressure, so all gaps leak outwards. Were the rooms in 6A in positive pressure?
No.
And the positive pressure without HEPA filtration is just an expensive way of challenging spores from outside to inside, and the air change rate is relevant.
Mm-hmm. So
irrelevant.
So what Mr. Hoffman is talking about is a situation, I think, first of all, when you're trying to control fungal spores from outside the hospital environment.
Is that how you read it, Mr. Minister?
I think what he's suggesting to me is that the important factors in ventilation for immunosuppressed patients are HEPA filtration and positive pressure to control Aspergillus spores. But from my perspective as an infection control doctor, I'm concerned with what's happening in the room and ingress of potentially contaminated air into the room, but also the activity in the room. For example, a staff member with a respiratory virus and when they might cough, and therefore you're not getting the rapid dilution. So that's why my view is that actually the air changes are of importance in that setting.
Well, I just wonder if that's sort of subsequent step. I just we'll have to go back and look at Mr. Hoffman's evidence, but I just wonder if he's saying, well, what we're talking about is excluding spores from outside. You do that with HEPA filtering.
Yes.
If you don't have a HEPA filter, or rather, sorry, if you do have a HEPA filter, then 3 or 6 air changes is neither here nor there. However, the point that I'm interested in, Mr. McIntosh, is I just wonder if what Mr. Hoffman is, just on the face of the email, is saying is about control of fungal spores from the outside, and he is concentrating on the utility of filtration for that. However,
I suppose with Dr. Inkster is this his lordship's question sets up a couple of pre-questions, which is, in this thread, if we go back to the beginning, does he know that you're discussing a ward without HEPA filtration?
At some point I have told him that. I can't remember if it's the beginning of the thread. But at some point I have told him that part of the ward is not HEPA filtered.
Was there any part of 6A that was...
Oh no, sorry, I'm getting mixed up with 2A. So I think...
Because this is before decant, so this is 2A, you're right. So he knows that part of the ward is HEPA filtered. So the first question is that paragraph, is he talking about the relevance of air change rates in the context of a HEPA filtered space or a non-HEPA filtered space?
I think we were talking at this point about Ward 2A and what was happening with the drains.
Right. Well, you wouldn't have known about 6A at this point because the dates don't match. So, but although the email is about the drains, and you've made the point that you're concerned about stuff coming into the room or being in the room from something other than the ventilation system.
Yes.
At this point, there are only 2 types of ventilation space in 2A.
Yes.
The isolation rooms, which have what air change rate?
10.
And they have HEPA filters.
Yes.
And the rest of the ward, which has what air change rate?
Slightly less than 3, I think.
And does it have HEPA filters? No. So when you read this, did you see this as, and if it didn't occur to you, please say, did you see this to be him discussing the isolation rooms, the rest of the ward, or both? Or you didn't occur to you at the time?
I think we were discussing the rest of the ward at this point.
But the rest of the ward doesn't have HEPA filters, so what do you make of his references to HEPA filters in this paragraph?
I think I would have to go back through these emails, sorry, just to see what exactly I asked him.
Well, if you go back to the...
I said out with the BMT rooms in the one below, when I referred to chilled beams and 3 air changes.
So you've actually asked the question below the page. On the bottom of the page, I have a question reventilation. You've asked about chilled beams, but he's replied in a way that discusses HEPA filters.
Yes.
Now, we asked him about this email. I didn't. My colleague did. We can go back and read his evidence and see what he thought. But I suppose the question for you is simply, having received this email in response to a question about outside the BMT rooms, why did you not, and we'll go and look at the emails, why did you not report this to the IMT? So hold that thought, and we'll go look at the IMT and then ask the question. So if we go back to the IMT to page 164 of Bundle 1. So this is the 14th of September IMT. And this is the one where you report that you're going to speak to Mr. Hoffman. And then if we go to the IMT that follows on the 17th of September, which is page 169, do we see your report back, which is on page 171? So what seems to be the case in this section is the only paragraph where you discuss Mr. Hoffman's views in this IMT is this second paragraph we've already looked at on this page 171. So it looks like you haven't described his views on air changes, positive pressure, HEPA filter, any of that stuff that's in that final email in response to your question about out with the BMT rooms.
Yes.
Why would that be?
I think as a clinician, we speak to experts and people all the time. I mean, not just in infection control, all clinicians speak to peers, they speak to experts. We don't have to report every aspect of that conversation back to an IMT. It might be what they feel is the most relevant features for an IMT. And at that point, I was in disagreement with Peter Hoffman about air changes. I didn't agree that air changes were just about comfort and dilution. And I didn't really want to cause confusion when we had obviously concerns about chilled beams and put mitigation in place by sending a message that actually that didn't matter, because that was the impression that I was getting from that email. In terms of the HEPA filtration and positive pressure, we had been doing the options appraisal approach. So we knew the challenges of sending patients to another area. We knew that they weren't in a protective environment at that stage. We knew that the only place that could offer that protection was the Beatson.
So at this point, which is the 17th, this is roughly the time of Jamie Redfern's options paper.
Yeah.
And the only options on site were adult wards.
So the only options on site were adult wards with the bone marrow transplant beds that became available in 4B.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so your answer is effectively, I didn't think he was right. I think he confused matters, so I didn't tell them.
Yes.
Right. Let's move on to we dealt with the decision on the next IMT to decant, and I want to look at the S-bar that was sent to the chair of the health board on the 13th of November. That's bundle 4, document 32, page 134. 133. And so this is a briefing paper, not an S-bar, but it's in an S-bar bundle, so we keep calling it that. But it's in the format of an S-bar. And if we see on the next page, do you see a risk assessment was completed? It's page 134 by the senior management team in the Royal Hospital, and a recommendation was made to the GGC board directors who approved this recommendation to move 2A, 2B to suitable accommodation at our building. Now, the reason I wanted to show this to you was just to check. Did you see this at the time?
Yes, I did.
At the time, did you ever have any disagreements with what's in it? Its narrative, its description of why things were done?
I don't recall any concerns at the time.
Okay. Ultimately, who chose Ward 6A out of all the different wards?
I believe that was the executive team. I believe the decision was made because that was a population that could be moved, well, no move straightforward, but relatively easily to the Gartnavel site. It's a care of the elderly ward, so I believe that it was the executive
But
team.
that wasn't your decision?
No.
As far as you looked at it, was just at a ward in the main tower?
A ward at the time in the tower, and then it was confirmed it was 6A, which we then obviously went to inspect the infection control team of unit.
Now, I want to move on now to a little bit of the epidemiology information that was available. I'm not proposing to go through that in detail with you. I just want to understand what material was available, how it was created, and what you did with it.
Yeah.
Now, there was you've explained that you had seen the Harvey Wood and Peters presentation to the hematology consultants.
Yes.
And you'd seen their later report.
Yes.
You don't appear to have reported that to the IMT. Is there a reason?
It was a different piece of work not commissioned by the IMT. So Ian Kennedy was asked by the IMT to do the epidemiology. This piece of work came about via a different route. So this piece of work went back to the time where we were looking at prescribing for meropenem in the unit. And Dr. Balfour had done an audit, and this is a piece of work that evolved from that. So whilst that report does contain very relevant and epidemiological information, which was really useful, if you read the full report, there is a significant amount on antimicrobial resistance and prescribing. So in units that we're involved with, specialist units, and I used to do this for adult bone marrow transplant, we would do a yearly review of all the infections and a yearly review of prescribing, and we would make recommendations. So it came about a different route. It wasn't commissioned by the INT, but then it did become very valuable for the situation we were faced with.
And then Dr. Kennedy produced his report.
Yes.
Now, he explains that the bacteria he's examining in that report arise out of a list of bacteria given to him by you. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
When did you give him that?
It would have been a few weeks before he produced the report.
So sometime would have been early 2018.
Early, sorry?
Early 2018 or in the autumn?
Towards mid 2018, I would imagine, yeah.
He maintains, and I think it's supported in an IMT minute, that you and he were to produce a joint report.
Yes, so
Why did that not happen?
I became available that there was obviously the microbiology report, and the intention was, and I think it's minuted, was to get everyone together. So microbiology, Ian Kennedy, but also Health Protection Scotland. There was a delay in his report. There was delay in the Health Protection Scotland report. I was trying to get meetings in the diary. We couldn't get everyone together. And then I think events just overtook us. Then we were into things like the Cryptococcus and a very busy spell in February. And I think the key here for this incident was that there wasn't a debrief. So had there actually been a debrief organised, that would have enabled us to pull all these sort of loose ends together. And it wasn't just the epidemiology report, it was things like the drainage report that I hadn't seen. And I think it was simply a case of not being able to get a meeting in the diary and other events at that point taking over.
Because one of the consequences of that epidemiology report not being completed is that you go into 2019 with, as it were, some unresolved, I wouldn't say differences, but differences of impression between the various bits of epidemiology. They show slightly different things, they look at slightly different things, they carry out slightly different bits of analysis. What do you think was the consequences of not drawing that all together in 2019?
So I suppose the IMT didn't draw it all together, but I drew it all together. So in the background, and I didn't produce a report, I was looking at ICNet all the time, which is our surveillance system. And I was doing my own work. And I think I did email Jennifer Armstrong at one point about that, telling her that, in my view, things really started to reach a peak in 2017 and then again in 2018. So I'd kind of done my own background, but very crude analysis that was certainly backing up the microbiology. I didn't feel Dr. Kennedy's report was too different at that stage. It was enough for me to know that we were on the right track with this at the time. And it wasn't that I was not going to have a meeting. It was like a meeting may not be required, and we just, we never got there.
And the IMT indeed formally ended.
It did.
Right. Yeah. I suppose this is a good place to do another look back. So if we find ourselves at that point, at the end of the IMT in 2018, roughly when did it end? There's some indication it might have ended at some time around about November.
November, yes.
Because we only have the IMT minutes. There wasn't a hot debrief or anything after this IMT?
There wasn't, no.
Was there any form of written report?
No.
And why was that?
So at the time, I think from middle of the incident onwards, we had oversight from Scottish Government. So we had regular teleconferences with senior staff in Scottish Government. And at one of those meetings, there was discussion about a debrief and what that might look like. And I think the incident was very complex. It was obviously involving the health board, executives, but also at that point, external agencies, including government themselves. And we were to go and have a think about what would that debrief look like and who would need to be involved. That eventually sort of morphed into not really a debrief, but an event that took place in the Golden Jubilee Hospital around July, August 2019, where representatives from GGC went and presented, I believe.
I may have missed it, but tell me more about this.
So it was an event that was held in the Golden Jubilee Hospital, and some representatives from the IMT, I believe, were invited to speak. I know that there was a communications presentation. I understand that was Sandra Bastillo and Jennifer Armstrong. I was aware that the infection control manager and nurse consultant for infection control attended.
So that would be Sandra Devine.
Yeah. I wasn't invited. I was still in post at the time, but I wasn't invited.
So this before or after you removed as the IMT chair?
It would have been around that time. I'm sure it was August.
So why do you know it happened? What's your source?
I was in the Jubilee Hospital on that day for another reason.
Of course. And did you see a sign up or something like that?
I saw people.
Right. So you've not seen emails or other written forms of communication. You've just seen the people who would make the penny drop. It's the same meeting.
No, I commented on it to someone and they told me what the event was about.
Right.
I can't remember who, but somebody confirmed that was.
Well, we better ask those people because they're still to give evidence.
Yes.
However, if we step back to November 2018 and we look back at 2018, now I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked yesterday about 2017. I'll ask a few more afterwards. If you've covered this in your statement in various places, and I can take you to them if necessary, but I thought I'd see if you could help me out with this, which is knowing what you now know, looking back at Ward 2A in 2018, before the decant, what is your opinion as to whether there was a link between patient infections and the water system?
My opinion is that there was.
So what was the mechanism by which you saw that link existing?
Basic principles of outbreak management. I have been dealing with outbreaks since 2009 as a ICD. I teach outbreak management at master's level. I was applying basic principles of outbreak management, which are epidemiological links in time, place, and person, the same infections in the patients that were found in the water. This was more complex than typical outbreaks, but it was, in my view, a polymicrobial.
You're going to have to slow down
sorry.
because
You are speaking rather
Sorry.
quickly.
If you
Dr.
go back
Inkster,
to
and
the
if I'm
basic-
to follow you, you really have to slow down a bit.
you go back to the basic principles of outbreak management. I think that may be the
Yes,
place to go and go a little
so-
bit slower.
So we had an epidemiological link in time, place, and person. We have a list of outbreak definitions in the National Manual, which goes beyond the traditional two linked cases in time, place, and person. There are other definitions. We'd met those. We then have infections in the children that match the bacteria found in the water. The nature of the outbreak was polymicrobial. So by that I mean several different types of genus of bacteria. And it was polyclonal. And by that I mean several different strains. And we had put in initial control measures to the water
Just so that I
system.
understand, the polyclonal means polymicrobial, presumably means many microorganisms as identified by genus and species.
Yes.
When you use the expression polyclonal, you mean?
So by genus I would mean perhaps Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, Stenotrophomonas. When I'm talking about polyclonal, I would be meaning different strains of Pseudomonas, different strains of Stenotrophomonas.
Thank you.
Are there any other factors that you would draw out in your, as it were, argument for a link?
We'd had initial control of the incident when we put the filters on the water, on the outlets.
And what would that tell you about whether there was a link?
Well, that is fairly strong in proving your hypothesis. If you put a control measure in and then you continue to follow the epidemiology and there's a reduction in cases, that strengthens it even further. We then unfortunately came on to a new issue, which was the situation with the drains. The reason that we didn't see a decline in infections with our measures there is because that situation was not under control. So we had continual problems with the drainage system. So we had an outbreak that was not under control. It's not unusual in complex outbreaks to not find the exact cause, to not find the exact solution. And well described in the literature is the fact that sometimes the only thing that has an effect is refurbishment or even building a new unit. And that is described for other situations. And that was where this outbreak was leading us to. Outbreaks are very complex. They are multifactorial and they're multimodal. And by that, I mean we have to put in a range of measures. It's very difficult for us to determine which measure has had the most effect. Sometimes we don't get the answer.
Slow down a little bit, please.
Sorry. So sometimes we don't get the answer. Sometimes we don't achieve control. And ultimately, what does achieve control is a refurbishment or moving patients into a new unit.
Now, I think there's two factors that have been suggested that some people take the view contradict your analysis, or three possibly. The first one is that what would you say to the argument that some or all of the improvements that you noticed were a consequence of the work done with line safety and hand hygiene and just general practice like cleaning that don't have an immediate direct connection to the water supply?
So these are all very important measures, and I think I talked yesterday about controlling routes of transmission, and those are part of the measures to control the routes of transmission. But we had implemented those measures very far back as August 2016, when we recognised there was an upsurge in gram-positive infections in all of the CLABSI type work. So that measure had been in place for a very long time and throughout the issues, in 2018 and 2019. And I would say that hemato-oncology staff are very aware of the risks of infection in children, and they are usually very stringent and very compliant with infection control measures. So to me, those measures are important, but they had already been put in place and continued, and we had evidence from us reviewing practice that they were continuing into 2018 and 2019. So it would be difficult for me to say that is a factor and it helps because it breaks that route of transmission. But that alone is not the reason, in my view, that things are now under control.
What would you say to the argument that some of the data in Dr. Kennedy's work and HPS's work that was produced in early 2019 seemed to show that in the last few years at York Hill, there were rates of gram-negative or environmental bacteria that were in many ways broadly comparable to the rates that were seen in the 4 years after the new hospital opened?
So I think we've been building hospitals since, for centuries. And in very early designs, you can see that people are starting to think that building a new hospital isn't just about a service, it's about making improvements in infection control. And you can see through time how that evolves into the development of specialist units like bone marrow transplant, infectious diseases. So every build that you have is an opportunity to improve on that and put state-of-the-art facilities in place. So it does not give me any comfort as an infection control doctor to hear that rates are the same as an old building. And one of the key pieces missing from all of this analysis is knowledge of the water systems and the environment in York Hill. It was an old building. I do know from...
So it was an old building? It
was an old building, yeah. I do know from working in Glasgow Royal Infirmary that just after the patients moved, there was Legionella testing done. I'm not sure why, but the counts were huge. They were in the tens of thousands, significant counts of Legionella. And at the time, it wasn't clear which infection control doctor would cover that area because they were obviously moving patients out. And I remember emailing the results to the infection control SMT. That to me is a suggestion that the water quality in York Hill was poor and may have been poor for some time. So by all means, these infections were seen in York Hill, but did they sample the water? Did they make a link to water? At the time, the only guidance was Legionella and then later Pseudomonas. So it's possible that they were not doing any additional water testing at the time in response to these cases.
Just taking this point on, I mean, you describe the water system in the old York Hill Hospital as poor. Could you just give me again the evidence that you point to for that proposition?
So just after patients moved across to the new building, for some reason Legionella testing was undertaken from multiple outlets in York Hill, and those results were very high. So
Right, okay.
They were-
So there were high Legionella counts in York
Yes.
Hill. Sorry, I had noted that you were referring to Glasgow Royal Infirmary at that point. So
sorry, I was working in Glasgow Royal Infirmary where the
Right,
water
okay,
lab is. Yes.
right. So you were talking about Legionella testing in York Hill about 2015?
Yes.
Right. Is there anything else?
Just that the counts were very high. So if you look at the guidance, a count of 1,000 would be an immediate, you need to make that water system safe, but they were significantly higher than that.
When it comes to, there's an observation in one of the HPS reports, that covers 2018, that the rates of gram-negative infections in the new hospital for children in hemato-oncology cohort are comparable to the rates in the Lothian and Aberdeen hospitals taken together. You've seen that observation in that report.
Yes.
Why does that not suggest that there isn't an issue, or there wasn't an issue? It's really just in the same way that if it's the same similar rates as in York Hill, if the similar rates in Lothian and Aberdeen, then it's really not a problem.
Well, again, we have no intelligence about those hospitals and their built environment and their water systems. And we're not comparing comparable populations, in my view, because the patients in 2A were bone marrow transplant patients, which the other centres don't have. And they're also a specialist referral centre, so they take the more complex cases, and they're also dealing with, the solid organ tumour. So I don't think that the populations are comparable, and those units are also smaller.
Wouldn't you expect to have a lower rate of gram-negative infections in a children's hospital that doesn't contain a tertiary centre for hemato-oncology patients? Because the patients are less vulnerable.
Yes, but you're always going to see gram-negative infections, even in that patient group, because of gut translocation, which happens to patients when they get chemotherapy. So the gut becomes very inflamed, and the bacteria in the gut then cross the lining of the gut into the lymph nodes and into the bloodstream. So it is inevitable that in this patient group you will see that phenomenon. But these are with organisms, not the organisms we were seeing, these are with organisms like E. coli, enterococci, and various anaerobes. So you are always going to see gram-negative
But just
infections
different
in that
ones.
group, but for a different reason and different ones, yes.
And the final observation relates to the topic of whole genome sequencing, which we discussed yesterday. I don't want to go into a huge detail, but if it's the case that there weren't close connections between the various patients who had these infections in 2A and the other patients who had the same strains in the same unit at the same time, and there weren't close connections between those patients, the bacteria in those patients, and the environment samples that were available, is that not a reason to suggest that there wasn't an environmental connection and that your opinion is misplaced?
Sorry, it's my fault entirely, Mr. McIntosh. Could I just get the proposition that you're pointing? Well, first of all, the distance I've got so far, you're pointing to the lack of identical strains.
Is that a close
the theme?
genetic connection?
Sorry?
A close genetic connection, my lord.
Yes, right.
So
okay.
in the absence of a close genetic connection between
okay.
patients who have the same bacteria strain infection, and indeed between those patients and the environmental samples that are available, what do you say? It's effectively Professor Leonard's hypothesis. What do you say to that the argument that that effectively excludes the link that you're making.
I would disagree for the reasons I went through yesterday. So I think I talked about the input, which was the sampling strategy, which was flawed. There wasn't sufficient sampling in the areas where the children were placed, both of the water system and the drainage system. So the sampling that we did was not what I would call representative.
Again.
Sorry.
I mean, it's partly a reflection of it. Speaking for myself, we're in an area where I'm not expert, and I'm keen to follow what you're saying and also note what you're saying. And that my ability to do that is very dependent on your speed of delivery.
So I talked about the input yesterday, and by that I mean the sampling strategy, which was not comprehensive for, I think, reasons I've explained. And that includes the water system, the water through the outlets, but also the drainage system. It was limited in terms of numbers, and it was limited in terms of time because we diverted resource elsewhere. So we do not have, a full representation of what was happening in that water system in line with the time period of the patient infections. So that's the first point. The second point is in relation to the colony picks. So the whole genome sequencing was done on the basis of a single colony pick, and I described yesterday, quoting evidence from the literature and also Suzanne Lee's view, that ideally we need 20 to 30 colony picks, and that wasn't done. And then I described the prolonged nature of the contamination going back to the installation and the likelihood of extensive biofilm, complex biofilm. And we are dependent on what is being sloughed off that biofilm at the particular time we take the sample. And that can change. So for that reason, I would not agree with that hypothesis. It was limited, it focused on one organism only, I believe, Enterobacter.
Yesterday, I asked you a similar question about your view there was a link between the infections in 2017 and the water supply.
Yes.
But we didn't go into it in the same level of detail. Your reason for having that opinion about 2017, looking back at 2017 and before, is that the same as what we've just heard, or is it more different? How would you, using those tools, how would you justify your opinion of the 2017 link?
It's the same reason. It's the same type of organism. It is the same diversity of organisms. And it goes back again to the fact that the system was contaminated at the time of installation. And I believe by that point in time, several years later, sufficient biofilm would have been built up. All of these organisms that we saw in 2017, 2018, 2019 are of the same category. So they are, I'm not sure this term has come up before. So the term is opportunistic premise plumbing pathogen.
So opportunistic premise
plumbing pathogen.
Premise as in the place.
As in the place.
Plumbing pathogen.
Yes.
Do they have an abbreviation?
OPPPS.
Please continue.
Sorry?
Right, maybe I need to take that again. Opportunistic.
Premise plumbing pathogen.
Thank you.
Right. What I want to do is ask the same question about ventilation in the context of November 2018. So, knowing what you now know and looking at the event at where we stood in November 2018, are there any infections that you consider that occurred before that date had any link to the ventilation system?
Potentially Aspergillus, particularly the first IMT in 2016. I think the 2017 one had a very clear link, and the more plausible hypothesis was water damage, but the early cases in 2016, yes. My concern, and again, I'm not a ventilation engineer and I was not able to test the hypothesis, but in 2017 we had several gastrointestinal outbreaks, rotavirus, astrovirus, and vancomycin resistant enterococci. So these are all gut organisms. And these outbreaks at the time were very prolonged.
Sorry, continue.
Sorry, these outbreaks were very prolonged. They were difficult to control. We were puzzled at the time as to why, with intensive infection control measures, we weren't bringing them under control. And when I read that report about the potential for the mixing of the dirty extract and the clean air, I wondered whether that had been a factor in why those outbreaks had been so prolonged. But unfortunately, I can't test that, and my understanding of thermal wheels is limited.
So if it's your theory is built around thermal wheels in essence.
Yes.
So what I want to do now is to look at the events that then flow on from November 2019. But before I do that, I wanted just to effectively touch in about your earlier evidence yesterday about the executive control group.
Yes.
Although there wasn't such a thing at this point, what level of executive control was happening around the decisions around decant and what was to then happen in the future around the rebuild of Ward 2A? Who was in charge of that process as far as you understood it?
So at the time, around the decant, the person who was most visible to me was Grant Archibald, the Chief Operating Officer. And in fact, he attended IMTs. I had also attended a meeting with the Chief Executive, Jane Grant. So at that time of the decant, to me, those two individuals at that level were involved, with other directors as well, the medical director, women's and children's director.
So once we get into the winter and into Ward 6A, what was, if anything, was the issue with the drains in Ward 6A?
The drains were inspected before we went in, and there was there weren't the same issues in Ward 6A with the drainage that we saw in 2A, and we put in place a regular drain cleaning programme to mitigate the risk. So as far as I was concerned, in 6A at that point, there was no issue with drains.
I'd like to move on to a side issue of Ward 4C.
Yes.
So get away from the 6A and the hemato-oncology patients. Who are the patients in Ward 4C at this point of the winter of 1819?
So 4C was a combination of two different groups. You have your general hemato-oncology. So within that, you have some patients who have neutropenia, but not all. And the other half of the ward was renal transplant.
So for completeness, you describe this in some length from paragraph 372 on page 125 of your statement. I'm not going to go through it in detail. What I just want to ask you is a question about the question of neutropenic patients.
Yes.
And so I'm right in thinking you had a meeting with Dr. Hart on around 7th December 2018. Yes. And do we see a note or an email exchange about that in Bundle 27, Volume 7, Document 20 at page 378? In the sense, this is an email from you to two people in their states, Ian Parry and Andy Wilson.
Yes.
Now, I wanted to firstly note in the middle of that third paragraph down, you've recorded that you've taken the view that there should be 6 air changes now at positive pressure and HEPA filtered rooms. And you've given some explanation in the previous paragraph. Now, the confirmation with Peter Hoffman, is that in the email exchange that we looked at previously or a separate email exchange?
That may have been separate.
But in any event, this is your opinion.
That's my opinion.
Yeah. Now, I want to go towards page 375, and I wanted to understand something about a reply that you received from Dr. Hart. So if we look at the bottom of that page, he replies to you on the 6th of December 2018. You asked him 3 questions, which we can actually see on the previous page, and he said that they constantly have patients with a recent history of neutropenia. Am I right in thinking, for completeness, that he's only talking about, as it were, his part of the patient cohort, not the renal patients?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Now, if we can take that off the screen, you then produce an S-bar, which is
Yes.
bundle 4, document 38, page 156. But this is in July. Why did it take you so long to produce your S-bar?
Because there was a lot of discussion about what could be done in this area, similar to previous discussions around the ductwork, the HEPA filtration, the challenges of trying to upgrade such a facility. Between, I think, December and July, I was working on the specification for Ward 2A, meeting with Matthew Lambert, Estates colleagues, project managers, as to what was achievable. And it became very clear to me that, in fact, what I had been told much earlier around ductwork and air handling was, in fact, achievable.
But you could get 6.
At least 6,
Right.
possibly higher. This was a minimum spec. So what I've put here is not the actual specification, but it's the minimum acceptable. And I was told previously that we couldn't do that. And obviously with 2A and what transpired, it was possible.
But in 2A, they had to fit a whole new air handling room.
Yes, so the phrase I was told at the time was, if you have enough money, you can achieve anything.
Well, I appreciate that, but if we just do the comparison, because this seems to be the point you're drawing. 6A is in the tower. Sorry, 4C is in the tower. It's on the 4th floor. There are wards above it and there are wards below it.
Yes.
I'm right there. 2A is on the upper floor.
Yes.
Of an upper floor in the children's hospital,
Yes.
and there was a void space above it.
Yes.
Which wasn't in use, and it now contains a whole air handling room.
Yes.
Yes. So would it be fair to say that it was possible to do what was done in 2A partly by the application of lots of money, but also because there was the space to put a special bespoke air handling plant in that void space?
That's possible.
It's quite a big void space. Have you been in it?
No.
No. It's worth saying I've been in it. It seems quite a big space, but what do I know? I'm only a lawyer. But the reason I wondered is there an equivalent space near 4C you could put a bigger air handling unit?
I'm not aware of that, no.
No. Was that something that was being discussed in terms of the possibilities of what could be achieved within the building envelope in those meetings?
No, I was simply told by Estates colleagues to tell them what I felt would be the minimum requirements, and that then we would look to see whether that could be achieved. But I didn't have knowledge of voids or air handling units at that time.
Are you aware of whether this 4C upgrade that you've set out in this S-bar has been done?
Up until the point I left, it hadn't been done.
Now, at some point, I think you had a meeting with Professor Steele on the 10th of December, 2018.
Yes.
And you explain in your statement that you, in the meeting, well, how did the meeting go?
Initially, it was a meeting to catch up about water, so that part of it went well. Then we moved on to ventilation, and at the time, I was struggling to get information from Estates colleagues. So by this point, I was aware of the Innovative Solutions report.
For 2A?
Yes, I was aware that the findings of that had implications for elsewhere in the building. I was starting to look at other areas in the building. and I was trying to get information around pressures. And I think H&V commissioning had come in. There were reports. I wasn't getting the information quickly enough, so I was bringing the issues up, and I was trying at that meeting to get an indication from Mr. Steele and others as to whether the arrangement in 2A was throughout the rest of the hospital.
The original arrangement in 2A?
Yes, so this abnormal ventilation system that the Innovative Solutions report describes.
Because isn't the abnormal ventilation system the innovative solution replies the same one that you had discovered in 2016 as a result of Mr. Parry's email?
No.
Why not?
In 2016, that was tears in the ductwork of the bone marrow transplant rooms.
No, there was the email we discussed yesterday in May 2016 in which Mr. Parry explained that there had been a derogation from SHTM 0301 to the air change rate that applied to, initially you thought all wards in the adult hospital, and then you realised it had applied to the children's hospital. We talked about it yesterday.
Yeah, no, this was different for me because this was a concept of thermal wheels, which I'd never heard of,
I see.
and an abnormal ductwork distribution.
So it's a different form of abnormality.
So in my mind, that was a very different form of abnormality than the sort of air change rate in the room.
May just be me then. So you're having the discussion with Professor Steele about the abnormality around thermal wheels and ducting. Has anything else arrived at the meeting that's remarkable?
Well, yes, because I told him that I was working on this S-bar for 4C, and that I would be sending it to him. And he said to me that he didn't want things in emails because that meant that they were out there. And I said to him, well, that's not how I work. I work with a written record, and I will be sending it. And he suggested that I print it off and hand it to him. And the other comment that he made was that I shouldn't be promising clinicians anything. And, well, I think this is important because when you're designing facilities, clinicians need to be at the very heart of it because they understand the patient group. So at the time, that's what he said to me. And at the same time, I had another director from another service. I was in communication with infectious disease physicians about their concerns in level 5. And that director said to me, these are my clinicians, you shouldn't talk to them. So at that point, I felt I was receiving, not just from Mr. Steele, but from others, resistance to what I was trying to do, which was to get a deeper understanding of that ventilation system. There were multiple issues all coming to a head, which I later then, going on for, I think after this meeting, put in an email to Dr. Armstrong and then Mr. Walsh.
And did you make a note after the meeting?
I did actually, because I was really concerned with what he said and I wanted a record of it.
So that would be
typed it up.
Bundle 14, Volume 2, Document 103, page 258. Now, we've read the note, and indeed it's been included in Professor Steele's document list for Friday. And so what I really wanted to understand is, was there eventually some form of meeting between you and him to attempt to resolve any differences between you?
No, the meeting came about because it was recognised that there needed to be closer working with estates colleagues. So the basis of the meeting was to try and improve communication and the flow of information. This note did actually then go on to feature at the meeting, but the meeting was not about this note specifically.
I see. And this meeting you're talking about was chaired by Dr. de Keester?
That's correct.
And would have been in March 2019?
Yes.
And do we see a minute of it? Bundle 14, Volume 2, page 400.
Yes.
Now, I absolutely appreciate that. I don't want to get into the details of the meeting because we can read all the notes and we can read all the emails. But Professor Steele maintains that you, despite an agreement at this meeting that you would share the reflective note with him, you did not do so. Did you eventually share the reflective note with him?
I did. My action from the meeting was to share it, and that has, he confirmed receipt of the note in an email, and I have submitted that email to this inquiry.
Is that Bundle 14, Volume 2, page 409?
Yes.
Where we see Teresa, thanks for the email and also the personal note from him.
That's correct.
On the 18th of June. Now, the reason I want to just check, because there might be some confusion, and I'm going to speak to him on Friday, and I don't want to minimise the area of doubt. The note that you sent him, is it identical to the note you submitted to the inquiry?
It is the note.
You didn't edit it in any way or make a shorter version?
Absolutely not, no.
Right. So the full reflective note that you wrote soon after the meeting in November is the note you sent to him in June?
Yes.
Is there any particular reason it took that long to send to him?
Because the minutes of the meeting and the actions took so long to come to me.
So you waited for the actions before you acted?
Yes.
We can take that off the screen. I want to look at an email just now. I'm just going to get it on my screen so I go to exactly the right page. Yes, an email that you have provided to the inquiry, which is of the 6th of December 2018. So it's bundle 27, volume 9, document 28, page 441. Now, what is this? It's an email to you from Dr. Armstrong at the top. But also there's a thread that goes down. In the bottom of it, this page, is an email the 6th of December 2018 from you, Dr. Armstrong, copying in Tom Walsh. And he's replied to Dr. Armstrong, bringing in Tom Steele and Sandra Devine. So if we look at the email at the bottom of the page, what are you trying to achieve by sending this email? What's the context?
So in this email, I'm basically writing directly to the HAI executive lead to make her aware that I have several concerns about ventilation, a number of issues where I felt there would be a benefit from having oversight and a project manager to really prioritise the issues and direct the resource. I felt at that point, for me as an infection control doctor, there was a lot needing done, and that there needed to be more of a sort of strategic plan by the organisation to deal with the issues that I've listed.
So the first one at the bottom, when it goes 1, it's in the second last paragraph, 7 lines on the bottom of the page, following the 2A, 2B, is that the Innovative Design Solution Report?
Yes.
And is this the abnormality that you and I just discussed?
Yes.
Right. And then over the page, you describe an immediate need for clinicians, states, and IPT to understand the ventilation setup.
Yes.
Now, the second one, what's this meeting that happened the day before?
So this is in relation to the upgrade of the negative pressure rooms in the intensive care unit. So
that's 5C.
No, well, it's the rooms that are used by 5C,
Down on the
but
third
they're
floor.
in the intensive
Right.
care unit. That was the output from the S-bar that I wrote on that issue.
I see. And 4C is presumably the discussion we just had about.
Yes.
And this is an email you sent. Right. And then there's endoscopy units as well. So you're basically listing a series of problems.
Yes.
Right. Now, the first thing, because it's obviously it's an issue I'm interested in, is why is the general air change rate issue not discussed in this list of the general ward?
I think if we could we go back? Sorry.
The previous page.
Point.
The bottom of the page.
So, although I haven't mentioned specifically air changes, I am talking about the 2AB report and the findings from that, which I believe at the time were evident, including executive level within the organisation. So I think that's why I haven't mentioned that. At that point in time, the air changes and the issue with the air changes were well known, but my concern primarily here was the pressures in the room, particularly in an infectious diseases unit. That's where I saw the main risk at that point in time, because I was concerned about patients with airborne infections being in a positive pressure room. And in my view, that put staff or visitors in the vicinity in the corridor at risk. So I'm escalating that as a priority at the time.
Now, you've covered this in a lot more detail from paragraphs 348 to 391 of your statement. I just wanted to understand what you feel would have been what difference would have having this group made in the following 12 months and time after that, if it had actually been set up?
I think that it would give ventilation a focus. I think we would have been able to work through the issues, prioritise some over others potentially. And as I said, there's a limit to what I can achieve and get people to do, because I have no remit over, other departments and resource allocation and that sort of thing. So, and it would be to keep things going, because in the position that I was in at that time, I felt like I was continually having to push, continually having to send emails to get things done. But if you have a situation like that project managed, you get very detailed timelines and, goals that you have to achieve by a certain period of time. So I felt that having that process in place, we would actually be able to make some changes in a timely fashion.
Now, what I want to do now is to turn on to the Cryptococcus and its IMT. I don't know how quickly we can do this, because there's a lot of material in your statements, the whole of chapter 13. And I think probably what I want to do, there's no need to go to the index, it's fine. What I probably want to do is to look at a few issues sort of grabbed out of it for context. And the one issue that sort of stands out in my reading of chapter 13 is your concern that there was some debate or uncertainty, the information you were receiving about whether there was pigeon waste or pigeons or dead pigeons in all, as opposed to one of the level 12 plant rooms. Now, I want to make sure that I've got all the information that you are pointing to, and I can discuss that with Professor Steele on Friday. So the first thing is we just check some photographs that we think came from you, which is Bundle 27, Volume 2, Document 19, pages 34 to 42. Next page. Now, stop me when you recognize one of these pictures. Is this your picture?
Yes.
Right. So we've seen these before. I'm not proposing to go through them again. It's just a process of checking that I've got them all in them. Which plant room is this, from your recollection?
So at the time, I went to the plant rooms with Colin Purdon very early in the incident. I have no idea which plant room this is. We went into more than one. There was so much confusion at the time as to what the plant room was, which area that it served. For me at that time, I just wanted confirmation of what I was being told, that there was pigeon droppings in plant rooms. So I remember going into 2, and then I remember handing it over to colleagues to do more work. So one of my colleagues went into, I'm not sure how many he went into, but he took samples. I had a biomedical scientist that came along and did ear sampling, I think, from all of them. So, and I think Dr. Peters may have been in them. So there were other people giving me accounts of plant rooms. And around the same time, because it was very confusing around, which plant room serves which area, Darrell Connor was tasked with developing a map, which later came to me, and he had highlighted in orange the different plant rooms and where the pigeon guano was predominantly. Now, there was one plant room where there was more than others, but the other 3 plant rooms did have, according to his map, guano in them as well.
How long did it take you to get his map?
I didn't get it immediately. I was concerned that it had been available and didn't come to the IMT or was discussed at the IMT, but I got it after the IMT. That would have been end of December.
Right. Because there's also a suggestion that you have a difference of opinion with Professor Steele about whether more than one plant room is affected. And there's an email exchange between you and him on the 21st of December, Bundle 14, Volume 2, Document 104, page 270. Now, you've just described this access to the plant rooms in this email at the top of the page, 270. And he's reporting in the email that he sent to you on the 21st of December that plant room that covers 6A is not one that's had any contamination. And the others that show the most don't cover Ward 4. I've asked for photographic evidence as well as video evidence that's available in all areas. Now, I'm just get the impression that you're not comfortable that that's accurate from your statement. Have I got that right?
Yes, I wasn't comfortable based on speaking to colleagues who'd accessed more plant rooms than I had and based on Darrell Connor's work. And the second part of that, the one that shows the most, doesn't cover Ward 4. It's not really about being the most, it's just, is it present or not?
I have to say I'm completely thrown by the fact that you weren't able to rapidly work out which air handling unit serves which plant room, which ward. And the reason I'm thrown by it is I've been in those plant rooms and I've seen how big they are and I've seen how confusing they are. And I'm wondering why there's not a label on each air handling unit saying this serves Ward X. Are you saying it took some time to work out which air handling unit was which?
Yes, when I went to the plant rooms with Colin Purdon, I didn't know what plant room I was in and what area it was serving, and neither did he. It seemed to take some time to get clarity on that.
So if we look at some information that I think I'm maintaining you didn't have when it was first available, if we can go to bundle 14, same bundle, page 290. And this is on the 9th of January. Is this you trying to find out whether there were photographs taken before the plant rooms were cleaned?
Yes, because at that point I had in my possession a report from GP Environmental. And it was a very strange report. It reported...
Is it this report, which is at page 4, is it bundle 14, volume 2, page 458?
No, it's not that report.
Okay. Then we'll go back to page 290. Please continue.
So it was a report from their inspection at that time, various different plant rooms. Each of the plant rooms, they had provided photographic evidence of what they found. And at the point that it got to level 12 in the report at the bottom, there was a description of pigeon guano that they had seen. Quite a detailed description, but there were no photos. And it struck me as extremely odd that every other plant room had pictures to back up the findings, but the plant room that had the pigeons and the most significant issue within it had no photos.
Is this page 445, the same bundle?
No, that's something different.
If we scroll down a bit further, where the entry for level 12 plant rooms?
No, that's not the report.
Okay. Go back to page 290.
It had plant rooms in the 40s as well. There were other plant rooms that they had inspected on the site.
And were you eventually sent some pictures by Professor Hood some years later, which is the same document, bundle, page 449?
Yes, that's correct.
Over the next page. Next page. These pictures, are these the ones that came from Professor Hood? Do you know when they were taken?
I don't know when they were taken. They were forwarded from Estates colleagues to Professor Hood later on during the advisory group that he was chairing.
If we take it off the screen. So firstly, I think it's pretty important that we do actually work out exactly which report you're taking to. So when you've completed giving evidence, would you please let your legal team know which it is, and we will add that to the documents we can put to Professor Steele. Now, could it be that what actually is happening here is simply a confusion in that people are describing things that exist in the world with words, and some people are describing them with words that minimize their significance, and other people, you, see that as somehow suspicious when it's just the way things are being described? Is this actually a failure to report, or actually more just a failure to describe?
My concern at the time and very early on in this incident, within days, was that there was a move to take this away from the plant room being the issue. That's how I felt.
Sorry, could you just repeat that, please? My concern was there was a move
to take the focus away from the plant room.
Right.
I felt that information wasn't particularly forthcoming. I felt people were holding back things. I felt there was an attempt to put other hypotheses forward that were not as plausible and remove the focus. And I wasn't alone with that because there were other colleagues of mine covering over weekends and some of the days because this was around the festive period. And we just felt that there was more to this. It's quite hard to explain that we were not being given all the information. I found it really difficult to believe that there were no photos available of what was described as an infestation and that it took 11 men to clean up. And I
Why
felt
do you say it
somehow-
took 11 men?
It was reported to Dr. Peters, and it's in an email from Dr. Peters, that it was 11 men to clean it up.
Ultimately, we'll get to Professor Hood's report in conclusion in a moment. But whatever view you take about its merits, it does consider the plant room as a hypothesis. So, and your AMT considers the plant room as a hypothesis. So whatever was going on to try and exclude the plant room hypothesis, that didn't work, did it? I mean, hypothesis was considered for some time. You'd accept that?
Yes, I accept that.
And whilst you ended up with criticisms of the significant critical incident documents that are produced about the 2 patients who unfortunately die, the original drafts of those documents talk about the plant rooms, albeit that then you complain that the drafts are changed. You're nodding again.
Yes.
Yes. So if there was an attempt to minimise the involvement of the plant rooms, we don't see it in the outputs of your IMT, the input into Professor Hood, and at least the early drafts of the SCI, do we?
No, but I believe we see that elsewhere.
So where do we see it?
We saw it in a report to the board where it was stated that the plant room hypothesis had been ruled out, and we see a response to that from Dr. Hood at the time, objecting to that response. We then see a bit later on the independent review, who appear to have interviewed one individual in relation to Cryptococcus. It was not Dr. Hood, and he was very upset when that report was published. He phoned me twice at the time. He used the words cover up, and he said he was going to go to the media. I discouraged him from going to the media. I told him to go to the Cabinet Secretary instead. I know he didn't do that.
But he's not able to give evidence.
He's not able to give evidence, but certainly all the way through this and post-independent review report, there was a feeling that information was being concealed and things were being covered up. And I was told by a senior member of staff that plant room photos, cleaned up plant room photos, were sent to the Cabinet Secretary to provide reassurance.
Which member of staff?
An occupational health colleague.
So how would an occupational health colleague know that?
Because they sit quite high in the organisation at committees, potentially. But I don't know how they know that. But, you know, with all of that, colleagues telling me it's a cover-up, another colleague talking about this.
But ultimately, we have to deal with evidence.
Yeah, sure.
And in terms of the evidence we have, the evidence we have is the absence of photographs before the cleanup. And that's one of your pieces of evidence, yes?
Yes.
A GP environmental report that doesn't contain photographs of those plant rooms, but contains photographs of other plant rooms.
Yes.
And the questions that were being asked in the IMT by people including Professor Steele, and that's about it in terms of evidence at the time. Would you accept that's the contemporaneous evidence of people trying to minimise it?
At the time, but then during John Hood's investigation, pictures of dead birds come to light from just a couple of weeks earlier, which we hadn't been told about.
This is before the Cryptococcus cases were identified.
It may have been before the child. I can't remember the date of the adult. And that's relevant in the timeline when you're investigating these cases to know the history of that plant room. So no one told us that just a few weeks before dead birds had been removed. And I found it hard to believe that the colleagues around the table were not aware of those reports at the time.
Well, what I'm going to do is move on, I think we'll probably ask you for the name of that occupational health person after the hearing and decide what to do about that. In your statement at page 28, on paragraph 62, you describe, and I suppose it's a summary section in a sense, that during the Cryptococcus IMT, you never experienced the undermining lack of respect to continue to challenge I experienced during the incident. In what way was this a change from the previous IMTs that happened up until this point?
It was stark contrast. The previous IMTs I'd felt, really well supported. I felt everyone was on board. There was challenge and debate, which is typical of IMTs, but I always felt that it was respectful. I hadn't encountered this sort of atmosphere in an IMT up until that point, and that goes right back to 2009 when I started chairing them.
And why do you think that change happened?
It seemed to me, the water incident, I felt very supported. I felt that patient safety was the absolute priority during that. Everyone worked really hard. And then when this came along, it seemed to be a shift in priority. I felt that there was more focus on organisational reputation rather than patient safety. I felt that people would have been very happy if at the beginning of that IMT I had said, these are 2 cases of reactivation, we need to do no more. I did not feel that there was any appetite to investigate this, put suitable control measures in place and get to the root of the problem. So I felt that at this point, organisational reputation was starting to feature. With the nature of the questioning and some of the alternative hypotheses that were being put forward.
What I want to do now is to move on to the decision to decant Ward 6A patients to the clinical decision unit, which you cover from paragraph 710 to 713 of your statement at page 234. Now, what I want to understand is that there seemed to be some more than one meeting going on here, and I'm trying to break this down. So firstly, if we look at paragraph 710 onwards, you've described how various people behaved and different meetings.
Yes.
There seem to be 2 meetings. So the first thing to ask is, did you ever receive any sort of feedback or comment from Dr. Armstrong about the decision to decant to the CDU?
I can't recall if she was at the IMT, but if she wasn't there, Dave Stewart was there, and everyone was in agreement at the IMT.
Right. So the IMT is, in your view, a consensus it needs to happen?
Yes.
And then there's a meeting that follows that, attended by you, Mr. Hill, Professor Steele, Jamie Redford, and Jennifer Rogers.
Yes.
Yes, and that's what you described in 710. What was the substance of the meeting, and what were you asked to do?
So when I went to the meeting, they explained that the chief executive was going to be on the site at 4 p.m. and she wanted to have a look around Ward 6A. They told me that they didn't feel that the decant was necessary. There was mention of me being risk averse, and maybe
So this is after the IMT?
This is after the IMT, and maybe that we could do this work with patients in the ward, which to me was too big a risk because of the release of fungal spores. So I basically gave my opinion that no, I felt that a decant needed to happen.
And then did you eventually have a meeting with the chief executive that you described in 711?
Yes, that was around 6 p.m. that day.
So who was present at that meeting?
So chief executive was there, Tom Walsh, Sandra Devine, Brenda Gibson, Jennifer Armstrong, Alan Mathers. I remember Jonathan Best, maybe Jamie Redfern or Kevin Hill, Jen Rogers.
Because you described that you didn't feel you were not backed up by Mr. Walsh and Miss Devine. You say they didn't disagree with you. How do you know they're not backing you up? What do you mean by that? Because it's not really very clear in the paragraph 711.
So it felt to me that there were a cast of thousands at this meeting, lots of people at this meeting. And really the conversation was just between myself and Jane Grant. Nobody else was really participating or giving a view as such. And normally, and what I'd experienced previously in the infection control team is we were, quite cohesive and that we would back each other up. And I felt that that wasn't happening at this meeting. I was backed up by Jennifer Armstrong and also Jonathan Best did support what I was saying. I suppose I would have expected to have that reassurance from the IPCT.
Obviously, we're not going to. The fact that someone didn't speak up in a meeting in this context probably isn't hugely. The reason I'm not asking is not because this meeting is, in essence, particularly important for the point. But are you trying to draw some point about the relationship between you and the other members of the IPCT senior management team?
Yeah, so I think around the same time as I described that shift in culture, there was a shift in their support of me as well.
In what way, and how did they evidence it apart from this meeting?
I felt that they were not really supporting me as much as they had in the past in terms of, trying to get things done. If we compare it back to the situation with Ward 4B and the options appraisal, they were very supportive at that time. They were very vocal. They were in agreement. They were happy to express that. They seemed to me behind the scenes at our meetings to be supportive, but it seemed to me that they weren't either able or willing to vocalise that, which at the point then made me feel that I was a lone voice.
Now, I'd like just to briefly touch on finish up this topic of Cryptococcus today by turning to the Cryptococcus IMT expert subgroup, which you cover from paragraph 719. So let me just be clear. In a sense, it was your view that you shouldn't be on it. Is that right?
No. So the reason I wasn't on it was workload. Significant number of incidents at the same time, and John Hood had been freed up from Glasgow Royal to provide some support. He obviously had an interest in ventilation, and also Christine Peters had a lot of experience in ventilation and had been helping me with Cryptococcus. So at that time, based on workload, I delegated that group to them. Unfortunately, Dr. Peters went off sick and John Hood took over. It was a bit later on in that there was a suggestion that I should remain independent from the group because John Hood, according to the terms of reference, this group reported to the IMT and would be directed by the IMT. So John Hood would have meetings with me and he would send me the minutes of emails, and there came a point where there was a suggestion that I had to be independent, and all of that interaction was to stop, although he did continue to speak to me.
When was that point when it was suggested that you needed to be independent?
That was around January. I remember receiving a phone call from the medical director saying to me, I think it's really important that you remain independent from this group, that she had spoken to Mr. Steele about it. And then a bit later on, there was an instruction from the ICM. She told me that I shouldn't be talking to Dr. Hood about these things because it could be construed that I was influencing him in some way.
I mean, as lawyers, we're quite used to the idea of not influencing people. It's sort of one of the problems that we have to deal with. Have you ever come across a situation in infection prevention control when someone's being told not to influence somebody else?
Never.
What possible reason can you think of for that instruction being given to you?
Again, I think this came down to an overwhelming urge to make this not about the hospital and to find another reason for these infections. Again, I felt it was coming down to organisational reputation.
So there's two issues I want to ask about the report, because we can read it,
Yes.
and Mr. Bennett, inquiry expert, has reviewed it and written a report, and he'll take his evidence from it. We've heard some evidence from Mr. Hoffman, we've heard evidence from Annette Rankin, from Susan Dodd, we've heard evidence from lots of people. Professor Steele will give us some evidence too. I get the impression from your statement that you're of the view that none of the members of the group were actually experts, including Dr. Hood, or was he then doctor or professor?
Doctor.
Dr. Hood, or Mr. Hoffman, or actually experts on Cryptococcus.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Very few people in the UK are experts on Cryptococcus. It's incredibly rare and it's something we rarely see. They have other expertise, ventilation, but not Cryptococcus.
And so I'm wondering why it's called an expert subgroup, because its membership, I won't go to the screen, is relatively large. It consists of a couple of ventilation experts, Dr. Hood and Mr. Hoffman. It consists of some representatives from NSS, an awful lot of estates and facilities people. Why was it called an expert subgroup?
So at the beginning, in the email that I sent to John Hood and Christine Peters, what I'm asking them to do, what I'm saying is, we're never going to find the answer here. I wasn't saying it was a plant room. I was basically saying, with the passage of time, we do not know what event took place. There are various different hypotheses. What I'd like you to do is work through those hypotheses, make sure we haven't missed anything, and ultimately make sure that we have got the protective environment in place for those patients. So that was the task of the group. So essentially it was at that point more about ventilation. Have we got this right in terms of the level of protective ventilation for patients? And they were experts in ventilation, Peter Hoffman, John Hood, Christine Peters.
But it wasn't they were experts in Cryptococcus?
No.
And presumably you're aware that NSS ultimately distanced themselves from its ultimate conclusions.
I am aware of that.
Now, I think you've probably almost answered it in your last answer, but I think I should check. What's your opinion of whether there was a connection between the ventilation systems that supplied wards 4B and ward 6A and Cryptococcus infections that the two patients who sadly died incurred? Do you have an opinion of whether there's a link?
I think there's a strong possibility there's a link. I mentioned yesterday when dealing with outbreaks, we think about probability. And on the one hand, we potentially could have two patients who had reactivation of Cryptococcus at the same time, very rare infection. On the other hand, we can have two patients with an epidemiological link in time, place and person, linked to a building where there is evidence of pigeon guano in a plant room and other areas. Not just that, patients who are not in a HEPA-filtered environment, and furthermore, patients who were not on appropriate prophylaxis at the time for various reasons. So in terms of the balance of probability, I believe there's a very strong probability that these patients acquired Cryptococcus from the building. In terms of whether it was the ventilation, the plant room or other areas, that is less clear, but the plant room is the part of the hospital that is housing all the air handling units. And the conditions in the plant room, it's dark, it's like a loft, you know, Cryptococcus will proliferate in that sort of environment, and we had evidence of the pigeon guano.
So what would you say?
Just a moment. And in that explanation, Dr. Inkster, you began by saying there was a strong possibility there was a link. Later on in what you said, there was a strong probability. Now, you may not have attached particular importance to these words. Lawyers see a difference between possibility and probability.
I would say probability.
You mean probability?
Probability, yes.
Thinking about possibilities just for the moment, as I understand it, pigeon droppings are a possible source of the Cryptococcus spores, but there are other possible sources. Am I right?
Well, the other sources that have been quoted are in relation to different species of Cryptococcus, which is found in the tropics, and yes, it is found in trees. But we don't have that here in the UK.
Well, I think I picked up from somewhere that we're talking about Cryptococcus neoformans.
Yes.
Right. That a possible source of that is in vegetation, soil. Am I wrong about that?
No, that's possible as well.
And if we think about pigeons, my understanding is that there are a great number of pigeons, not only in the plant room. Well, sorry, I'm making an assumption here that the outside environment of the Queen Elizabeth campus contains many pigeons.
Yes.
Right. Now, maybe you've answered this already, but what do you see to be the importance of pigeons or pigeon guano in the plant rooms as opposed to pigeons and pigeon guano in the wider environment of the hospital campus?
It's because of the presence of the ventilation systems and the air handling units, and that, in my mind, is a route to both of these patients, by which there may have been a significant dose or bolus of Cryptococcus in that ventilation system. There are obviously a lot of pigeons around the site. It is possible they came in via another route. No building is completely sealed. The theory that people might bring this in on their feet, I suppose for me in outbreaks, we're always looking for things that have changed. So that might not be a new phenomenon. And I think Mr. Hoffman maybe described this better than me, but by the time someone has stood on that outside and made their way up to a ward, it's going to be perhaps more ingrained in the shoe or fallen off. And there isn't that same mechanism of releasing Cryptococcus into the ventilation system, in my view.
I no doubt should have picked this up before, but is the inlet or is the source of air, which the air handling unit, which is essentially just a fan as I understand it, is the source of air within the plant rooms, or is it external to them?
It's brought in externally, but the route from the plant room into the ventilation system, there's various ways that it could have reached the ward. I'm not sure I'm explaining this properly. There are other areas like through the void and risers that I believe the pigeon guano could have reached the patients.
Right. So I shouldn't just think in terms of proximity to the
No.
inlet for the air handling unit. Right. Thank you.
I think I have one
sorry,
remaining
Mr. Mayor.
question before we take a couple of break, which is simply, I'm assuming you have read Professor Hood's report.
Yes.
Mhm.
He has reached a different set of conclusions. And I recognise I've now put you under pressure for the suggestion we're about to have a break, but why is he wrong and you're right?
As I've said before, very early on, we don't know the answer here. We're never going to know the answer here. That wasn't the aim of the group. The aim of the group was to make sure that this wouldn't happen again, that we had covered all possibilities and didn't find any particular reasons for the ingress that we had missed, and most importantly, to make sure that the most vulnerable group of patients were protected from any further risk of Cryptococcus.
That didn't answer my question. I realise he wasn't originally asked by you to work out an answer, but he did by the end look at various hypotheses and grade them. And the hypothesis that, sort of the case theory that you've just posited, is one he considers to be, well, he doesn't consider it to be very probable or probable. Why is he wrong in his analysis and you're right in yours, even though he was asked to do something different, because presumably what he did changed over time?
Again, for me, this goes back to the basics of outbreak management. And I'm not sure that the epidemiology was properly considered by the group, because there were other cases and none of that was part of the expert advisory's role to look at that. So whilst he might have reached that conclusion, it wasn't reached in conjunction with all the available facts at the time.
I suspect we could probably continue that topic for a lot of time, but we probably haven't got the time to do any more details. So I would suppose now is the time to have our break.
Right, we'll take our coffee break now. Could I ask you to be back for 12 o'clock, please? Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Muller. I wonder, Dr. Inkster, if we can look at an email exchange between you and Dr. Armstrong on the 5th of February 2019, which is in Bundle 14, Volume 1, page 779. So this is you listing various concerns you have about the workload of your team. If we just zoom in at the top half of the page, please, it'd be helpful. No, 779, just the top part of the half of the page. We could just zoom in across. Thank you. So what was the reason that you contacted Dr. Armstrong on the 5th of February that prompted this response?
So at that point, I felt that the workload was becoming quite extreme. So this was not normal ICD workload that I was experiencing. Various different incidents, some which relate to the Queen Elizabeth, but others across the whole of GGC.
So if we think of your 10 sessions, and I
Yes.
appreciate at the time you had 5, I still had 5 for infection control at this point?
On paper 5, but at that point I was doing 10.
10. So when were you doing your microbiology work?
Well, I wasn't at that point. Very rarely. I spent maybe one morning a week, if that, in the microbiology duty room.
And so what is it that you were asking for at this point?
Basically help, extra resource, extra ICD resource, and people who were experienced to come and assist me with dealing with all the issues that were going on, which were outbreaks and ongoing issues with the building. At the time, I recall my colleague, John Hood, coming across because he had been freed up to help. And he said to me that, you're doing the work of 4 people here and that's not sustainable. It's only really sustainable for 2 weeks. He was a very experienced infection control doctor, and we had periods of extreme intensity. We had one afternoon where we had contaminated water results to deal with. We had an outbreak, an IMT that had to be set up on a Friday afternoon, which is never a good time, with multiple actions from that. And one of my other colleagues was coming under pressure to sign off an intensive care refurbishment on a Friday afternoon. So we had 2 or 3 hours of very intense workload. And I was fortunate to have colleagues around to support that, but that was, not unusual to have several things happening at the same time. And I was basically asking for help.
When you say colleagues around, were these colleagues who had infection control sessions, or were they microbiologists?
No, so, Dr. Hood wasn't officially an infection control doctor, but he helped support with the ITU project that afternoon. And another colleague, Dr. Wright, stayed late and helped me with the actions from the IMT, because we had to start a process of screening lots of patients in the laboratory.
And was Dr. Wright doctor ICD sessions as well?
Sorry?
Did Dr. Wright have ICD sessions?
No, she did not, no.
So the thing that wondering here is you received this response from Dr. Armstrong, and she's agreeing that the arrangements should be put in place. What were the arrangements that were then generated as a result of this reply?
So we had Dr. Hood at the time. We had an S-bar was produced by Tom Walsh, asking for an additional 2 infection control doctor sessions to help support me. But at the time that S-bar was released, the lead consultant for decontamination had given up his sessions, and there were 2 sessions vacant. So all these extra sessions did was just stop me from even more work piling on, if you know what I mean, rather than taking work away from me.
So these sessions were the 2 new ones and the 2 from the lead consultant of decontamination. Was that mean you can bring in an extra extra person or persons to do those 4 sessions? Is that how we should understand it?
No. So I had an extra 2 sessions, but I had to allocate those to decontamination because the previous individual had resigned. So,
right. So that didn't help you? It
didn't help me because that was it stopped me having additional workload at that time.
Right. But the 2 extra sessions that Mr. Walsh was suggesting, would they have been extra actual?
No, they were not actual extra. They were used for decontamination.
Was there any actual new additional sessions, however temporary, suggested at this point?
No. So there was some sort of ad hoc support on some days. A colleague might come across from Glasgow Royal Infirmary. So on one occasion, one of the doctors, Dr. Jamdar, who did have infection control experience, came along for 3 days, and that at the time was really useful because she was someone who could function independently and just run with things herself. And for those 3 days, that was big assistance to me, but that was not extended beyond that. And then we had some discussions about locums, bringing someone else in to support. And then ultimately, Brian Jones approached Stephanie Dancer.
So when Brian Jones approached Stephanie Dancer, did he have authorization from anyone to do this? Or where did he get the sessions from, effectively?
Well, I suppose Dr. Jones at that point was the head of service for microbiology, and with Rachel Green being involved, the clinical director, they would have, I suppose that would be a decision that they would be able to make.
But they'd have resource, potentially, in their world to use.
Make that happen.
But those wouldn't be infection control doctors under Mr. Walsh's system, would they?
No, they would not be.
Was there any... he's given quite clear evidence in his statement of seeing quite an important distinction between those who are doing infection control sessions and those who aren't. So this extra capacity, which turns potentially into Professor Dancer, would that have been as a microbiologist, effectively?
It would have been as a microbiologist with infection control experience supporting me.
And would that person have sat inside Mr. Walsh's management structure?
No.
Did that ever become an issue?
Well, she was only there for 2 days.
Well, we'll talk about why she didn't stay or even come in a moment. Now, she's given evidence. I don't know whether you had the opportunity of watching it.
I did.
Right. Well, we can take it sort of quickly. She produced extracts from her emails. Indeed, she's provided the inquiry with the actual emails subsequently, but we'll just look at Bundle 27, Volume 7, page 574, the speed. And as far as I can see from the email thread, your first engagement is that you contact her on the 12th of February.
Yes.
Now, you've heard her evidence because you've watched it. Up until the point that she discovers she's no longer required, as it were.
Yes.
Is there anything that you would say that she's got wrong about the narrative of events, where she goes, who she meets, what she sees?
No, I don't believe so. I recall giving her lots of background information about the incidents I was encountering at the time. I was quite keen. Stephanie trained me, basically, and I had a lot of respect for her. And in terms of infection control, she was someone that was ahead of the game, and I was sense checking a lot of stuff with her. So she got an overview of the incidents at the time, including one that is not part of this inquiry. And I took the opportunity to take her to that particular ward and some other areas of the hospital that were concerning me. I was obviously concerned about plant room hygiene at the time, so I took her there. And I think I took her to just one of the general wards to show her the layout.
And did she meet Mary Ann Kane?
She did on the second day. She was by that time in Dr. Peters' office, and I recall her meeting with Mary Ann Kane.
Right. And was it effectively she would have been sitting in Dr. Peters' office if she'd arrived and started work?
Yes.
Right. And eventually she didn't come.
Correct.
Now, she's given a particular narrative, actually, in these emails.
Yes.
About why she thinks she didn't come, how it was that the offer was withdrawn
Yes.
at a late stage. And you've heard that. It's not reflected in your statement. In fact, if we go to paragraph 776 of your statement, in page 253, bottom, 4 lines at the bottom where you describe she attended the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for just 2 days before being told by Professor Brian Jones her service was no longer required. No explanation was given to me for that decision. Her evidence to the inquiry was that the information she describes in her emails about Professor Leonard being the reason that she had her offer withdrawn must have come from you, because you're the only person she spoke to about this. That's not consistent with saying there was no explanation given to you. Was an explanation given to you?
There was no explanation given to me, but I was not aware of Professor Leonard's role in any of this until I received the email from Stephanie that she'd sent to Professor Jones. I wasn't aware. It was the first time I'd heard the term Glasgow Boys, and it was the first time I knew about a situation with her and Professor Leonard that is referenced in those emails.
So why do you think she's saying that, and she understood reasons from her conversation? Is she inferring something, or are you missing something from your statement?
She must be inferring something. She maybe assumes it was me, but it wasn't me at the time. It was news to me that he had any involvement with it.
On the terms of the substance of the decision, the explanation that she's given by Professor Jones, which we can find on page, if we go back to bundle 27, volume 7, we find them at the top of page 578. So the reason that Professor Jones gives her is that we read it in the first paragraph, I very much regret to inform you, that one, and that there's a proposal to restructure and support the services differently, incorporating the 2 sessions intended to you into a more substantive post to support the services in the long run. Now, we can't ask Professor Jones what his understanding of this is. What I'd like to understand from you is that was the 2 sessions that Professor Jones was offering a temporary arrangement or a permanent arrangement?
It was temporary at the time, and it would be dependent on, I suppose, how things progressed and workload issues and whether those eased off, but it was not permanent.
It was effectively a sort of locum in a sense.
Yes.
Is there any difference in the timescale it takes for the NHS Greater Glasgow to recruit and put in place a more substantive post than a locum post?
Yes, because there's a procedure to be followed. There's a job description that needs to be written and signed off and approved by HR department. It then has to be advertised. Funding has to be secured. It then has to go to an interview stage. So generally speaking, it could be as much as 6 months.
Do you think a substantive post of 2 sessions would attract applicants?
Highly unlikely to. It's 1 day a week.
What I'm wondering is that how realistic is the explanation that Professor Jones is given as a way of resolving the problems that you were facing at the time?
I wouldn't say that that was realistic at the time.
Why is that?
Because I know the time it takes to get a substantive post in place. And I know that 2 sessions would be very unattractive to people who are looking for a substantive post. Most people want to, have at least a part-time 6 sessions or more.
So you'd need to plug it together with other sessions from somewhere else?
Yes, you would. I mean, it would probably only attract someone like, say, for example, myself right now in RHI. If I felt that I needed maybe to have a day in the clinical setting just to keep up the clinical aspects. So it might attract someone like that, but there's not many people around, I feel, in the microbiology world who would be attracted to 1 day a week.
So you'd effectively have to go and find other sessions and plug them together into a job?
Yeah, you would have to. You'd have to negotiate with other hospitals potentially, or, external agencies, and try and plug something together. It might suit someone who is retired and wants to come back for a day a week.
But would it have made a difference to your problems that you were facing in February, March?
To have someone present.
In a substantive post?
Oh, in a substantive post, absolutely, yes.
But when would that substantive post have actually started working?
Well, I know that it didn't start because when I later resign and have to rejig my job plan, those substantial sessions were still available, and that was at the start of September, and I took those, and they were put in my job plan.
So you took the 2 microbiology sessions that were intended for Professor Dancer?
No, there was at that point a plan for a substantive post, but it hadn't been advertised.
Right.
And because it hadn't been advertised, but was in the planning, I was then able to approach and say, well, actually, can I take those sessions into my job plan? And then the subsequent advert that would come out would include my infection control sessions.
So how many sessions did you absorb into your job plan then in the end of the year?
Do you mean when I resigned?
Yes.
10
So
microbiology sessions.
So you had 5 before?
Uh-huh.
So you acquired 5 more in
Yes.
that restructuring, and you're saying 2 of them came from this process, you
Yes.
think? What I want to do is to take that off the screen and just I want to raise the issue of duty of candour, which came up. We can go to page 187 of your statement, please. And we look at paragraph 547. It seems that 547, 548, you're describing how a realization occurred to you that you probably ought to think about some duty of candour retrospectively.
Yes.
And you discussed that with Dr. Armstrong. Are you able to give us a date or even fit it into the chronology of when you would have had that conversation with her?
I think around February 2019.
How does that relate? Is it before the Dr. Mathers, Dr. Gibson, SBAR, which we're probably
Yes.
about to come to, before then?
Yes.
What was her reaction to the discussion of the need to, by you, suggestion that you should deal with duty of candour retrospectively?
I felt that she was very supportive and that she agreed. And that's why she then asked me and Brenda Gibson to go meet with Alan Mathers. And she tasked him with interviewing both of us, and he then produced that SBAR.
So effectively, she sent you to create a process. And
Yeah.
you did an exercise.
Yes.
And that's the SBAR, which is at Bundle 4, Document 36, page 151.
Yes.
And in this email of the 1st of March, 2019 at 8:26, the bottom of the page.
That's correct.
Now, what do you understand to have been the things that occurred as a consequence of this SBAR?
So, as a consequence of it, I remember having a further discussion with Alan Mathers, and he informed me that there was going to be a review group, and the review group would consist of Sandra Devine, Professor Brian Jones, and Ian Kennedy.
The events that are the subject of this SBAR occurred while you were on long-term sick. Have I got that right?
That's correct.
Who was acting as lead infection control doctor at the time these incidents occurred?
Professor Brian Jones.
And who was lead infection control nurse at the time?
That was Sandra Devine.
Is there anything we should read into? Should we be concerned that the review group is the people who were responsible for the infection prevention control team with Mr. Walsh at the time of this incident?
Yes, and I raised that with Dr. Armstrong herself. I suggested an independent microbiology consultant from Glasgow Royal Infirmary who had no input into the RHC.
And did the review group carry out any work as far as you know?
I never saw any output from the review group. I later saw an email from Dr. Chowdhury, who I think had not been involved with the cases because she, I think, was appointed later.
Is this an email where she reviews the cases and reaches certain conclusions?
I believe so, yes.
And just to put it in chronology, is that an email? I will just give you the date. An email of something like the 27th of July. Is that the right date?
I would expect so.
Right.
Around that time.
I won't put it on the screen because it's so heavily redacted. It's largely meaningless. Now, are you aware of whether anything was done to deliver any duty of candour information to any of the families involved in either the SBAR or Dr. Chowdhury's review document?
No, so after Dr. Chowdhury's review document, I recall emails from Brenda Gibson, at least 2 emails, prompting Alan Mathers and Jamie Redfern for a conclusion. Had these cases been reviewed? I recall her sending emails. I'm not aware that there was ever any duty of candour event with these families.
And in essence, without trying to stay away from the detail, just to get the governance issues, in essence, is it the suggestion that Dr. Chowdhury has concluded that one of the children involved, there is a connection between that child's death and a particular named microorganism that's associated with water?
Yes.
Was there any other outputs from that particular SBAR by Dr. Mathers, the original one in March? Might it be, for example, connected to the epidemiology work that Dr. Kennedy does in 2019?
No, I don't believe so. I think that was already underway, and I'm not quite sure how that would have impacted on the duty of candour aspects. I think that was a separate process
piece
that
of
we
work,
had
right.
already started.
It may be I just misinterpreted something Dr. Kennedy said. If we go to your statement on page 330, it's a long way ahead. Now, at that point, you've, if I'd like to say, perhaps unhelpfully, decided to use bullet points rather than the referencing. So it's on page 330 of your statement, and it's the bullet point at the bottom of the page that begins in September 2022. Do you see that paragraph?
Yes.
Now, just so we can help find it again, it's in the paragraph. The bullet points are part of paragraph 1064, which begins on page 326. So it's 4 pages after that. Now, if I understand this, what's the point you're making in this paragraph?
So the one starting in September 2022.
Yes.
So as microbiologists, if you were the duty microbiologist for paediatrics that day, one of your tasks is to go through the reference laboratory reports that come back, and then you action those reports. So you give them to the people that need to see them. And on that particular day, one of my colleagues reported a typing result for Stenotrophomonas to the infection control team, and I was copied in as a group of consultants covering paediatrics. The colleague was challenged as to why the sample had been sent for typing, and the email said that it wasn't for infection control to deal with. Our procedure would normally be to send any typing results to infection control, because usually there's a reason for them, and that might be outbreaks or previous incidents or a organism that we're particularly interested. And I think there was a discussion about not having a database for Stenotrophomonas typing results. That had been one of the recommendations from the case note review. So throughout our incident, we did not have a robust means of recording all these results, and it was a recommendation, I believe, for that, and that hadn't been put in place. And then there was confusion about actually who would own the database that had been put together for the water testing results. Was it infection control or was it microbiology?
Because the reason I was struck by this is you also mention in your I won't go to the thread because I think it's. What I'm wondering is, were you able to work out what year these Stenotrophomonas results were from?
So this would have been September 2022.
No, this is when they happened, the testing. But do they relate to? Do they in any way relate to the patients in 2017?
I don't believe that particular result did, but I think there was one subsequently that someone else did that did link back to patients.
Right, because that's what I wanted to be clear about. Because if you look at the end of this paragraph, you go, my colleague Dr. Peters highlighted that there have been 2 cases with a striking match over the page to one of the patients in 2017. So you're not saying that's in this set?
I'm not sure if that's the result I was referring to, or if she was just highlighting the fact that
there had been another one.
And I think her point would be, this is why this is really important, and it's why people need to take action when they're sent these results.
So your point is that you need to take action, there needs to be a database.
Yes.
There hasn't been, at this point, implementation of the case notes review recommendation.
That's correct.
You're not drawing any other particular conclusion? No, thank you. Right, we can take that off the screen. What I want to do now is to move to summer 2019. And I wonder if we can get a feel for what your working relationships were at the beginning of June with medical director Sandra Devine, the new deputy medical director, the executive team who you were dealing with.
I felt that relationships were becoming strained at that point in time. There was a sort of background to that. There had been a Healthcare Improvement Scotland inspection earlier in the year, and they had interviewed me, and it was very different from previous interviews in that they said they wanted to ask me about culture. And this was around the time of the issues with ventilation and cryptococcus, which were I was having problems accessing information, and there wasn't good working between infection control and estates. And there were obviously a lot of staffing issues, so I told them all of that. Dr. Armstrong was contacted. She did come and speak to me, put in the mentoring process, and while I felt she was very supportive, she also suggested that I had whistleblown to Healthcare Improvement Scotland and that I should be doing things internally. And I think at that point, I had become labelled as a whistleblower. Subsequent to that, I had submitted the report with Stephanie Dancer to the, sorry, I can't remember the exact name of the committee, the Health and Sports
And
Committee.
this was a ostensibly anonymous report.
It was, but the reports had been brought to Dr. Armstrong's attention, and she came to my office and she wanted to discuss them, and I felt at that point that I had to tell her that it was me.
And did you take that well?
She mentioned something about lack of trust at that point.
When you say that she suggested you might have whistleblown to Health Improvement Scotland, I have to confess, not being an expert, it's a complicated field of the law, so we're not expressing an opinion here, but you didn't approach Health Improvement Scotland, they came to you.
They came to me, I wasn't even on their list. My colleague, Dr. Valaraki, was meant to speak to them and she went off sick. And my other colleague was part-time, so I was the only ICD on the site, so I had to go. You can't refuse to attend an interview with Healthcare Improvement Scotland. So, and it was clear they wanted to explore the culture. They knew at that point about the action plan from my colleagues because they asked me for the version that I had. So they clearly had some sort of background information before they came, and they asked me questions which I answered honestly.
So if you did, as it were, with a small w, whistleblow in that process, it wasn't that you sought them out, they came to you?
Absolutely not, no.
Right. I'd like to look at the first and second IMTs of the summer. So if we go to Bundle 1, Document 72, page 320, I'd like to understand who's turning up to these meetings. And why are they there? Because this is from our lists, the first of the gram-negative bacteriemia pediatric oncology IMT. Have I got that right? The first one?
That's correct.
Yes. Now, why is everybody here? In a sense, I don't need you to explain why treating clinicians are present because we'll just take that as an assumption. So we don't need to name them. But going through this list, you're there because you're the chair of the you're the lead ICD.
Yes.
Ms. Dodd is there because she's the lead ICN for pediatrics.
Right.
And then, what's the next person on the list who's not a treating clinician?
Jen Rogers.
And why is she there?
She was the chief nurse.
And she covers pediatrics.
Correct, yes.
And why is Karen Connolly there?
She's facilities.
And then the next person who's not a treating clinician is?
I don't recall who she is.
But the next person who stands out as a person who might not be a treating clinician?
Gail Rolls, but she was a senior nurse within the RHC.
Right, and Mr. Dell?
Press office.
Dr. Kennedy, why is he there?
I think he was there because he had been involved in the 2018 IMT, and I think at that time we were dealing with gram-negative bacteremias again, so it would make sense to include him for continuity.
So he's continuity, right.
Epidemiology. Yeah.
And Mr. Connor is facilities?
Correct.
Mr. Purden is estates?
Correct.
Susan McFarlane, what?
Can't recall.
And then Dr. Chowdhury is a treating clinician.
Yes.
Right. We then go on to the next one, so that's at page 325. Membership's grown a bit, and this is on 25th of June. So looking at people who weren't at the previous one, we've now been joined by Sandra Devine. Any particular reason she feels she's coming to this one?
She's the infection control manager, but she would generally be present at that IMT, so there may have been a reason why she wasn't at the first one.
And Mr. McDonald?
Facilities.
Kevin Hill is the manager for children and families.
The director.
Director, sorry. Mr. Redfern, we've met before. Mr. Dell, we've discussed. Morag Jones, I don't think
I can't
you
recall.
can't recall. Professor Steele, Mr. Connor, Annette Rankin's arrived from HPS.
Yes,
This is presumably because there's been a high report.
yes.
Janet Young,
Janet Young was one of the laboratory managers,
Angela Howard.
senior charge nurse on the outpatient ward.
Now, Dr. Deegan's arrived. Now, he explains that he's arrived because Scott Davidson couldn't come.
Correct.
Would that have been explained to you at the time?
I think I would have known to assume that at the time. It might not have been explained,
Right. And then Dr. Kennedy again, and Sandra Higgins,
but laboratories.
Gail Rolls, we've discussed, and Dr. Sastry we know about. Now, so you report in the appropriate membership, and every one of these minutes, it's agreed that all necessary professionals are present and represented in the meeting. How much control do you have who turns up to one of your IMTs as the chair?
To a certain extent I do, but it becomes very difficult when it is, individuals who are part of the executive team. It would be very difficult for me to ask them to leave the room.
Do they tell you they're coming, or do they just arrive?
No, they would just arrive.
There's been some suggestion that you, that at this point, you might have previously had pre-meetings for some of them to brief them.
Correct.
And who would you have briefed?
So those weren't set up by me. I can't remember who set them up, but generally speaking, Sandra Devine would be there, Tom Steele, either Chris Deegan or Scott Davidson, Kevin Hill, maybe Jamie Redfern.
And from your point of view, what was the purpose of these pre-meetings?
So as these IMTs and some of the feedback from the 2018 IMTs, there seemed to be individuals who were uncomfortable with me bringing results to an IMT and presenting results at the IMT before they had seen them. From my perspective, that's how IMTs are. You're going there knowing that you're going to find out new information. You've got multiple different colleagues around the table, all of whom are bringing information from their particular area.
It's a working meeting in a sense.
It's a working meeting, and microbiologists will come with information that I haven't heard before. So, for example, Kathleen Harvey-Wood coming to an ITU meeting would be presenting information that I, as the chair, haven't heard before, but that I can assimilate and analyse in the space of the meeting and use that to inform decisions. And there seemed to be concern about that happening, but equally with that, people have been very clear that their remit is not to interpret results, and that is my remit. So I was comfortable undertaking that in the IMT, because the alternative is that I then need another meeting later in the day, and the clinicians are far too busy. People are too busy to have two meetings. So if I have results in front of me or emailed to me by the lab, then I'm going to just take the opportunity to deal with them as they arise.
So how did these sort of almost special pre-meetings for the people you've mentioned, how did they assist that particular problem?
It put pressure on me in the laboratories to get results in time so that we could go there, talk through the results and come up with a plan and how the IMT was going to progress and the route that the IMT was going to go down before we'd actually had the IMT. So it may have helped certain individuals in the room have, I think, a level of control over the situation. It didn't particularly help me or the laboratory staff. It put additional pressure on us.
Might it have resulted in... Is it not possible that if you imagine a scenario where you receive some information, you prepare your briefing for the pre-meeting, you have the pre-meeting, it comes to some form of approximate conclusion about where the IMT is going, you then have the meeting and there's new information. Is that not going to just make it worse that people are confused at having information in the middle of the meeting?
Do you mean people are confused about me delivering information?
No, it's just if the critique, which seems to be the critique, is that you receive information in the middle of the meeting. And the most extreme example is handwritten notes with numbers on them.
Yes.
But obviously there's also estates people turn up with information and
yes.
Clinicians turn up with information. So if the critique is that that's somehow difficult for some of the people the IMT to work with, and those people are largely the executive people, is effectively what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. Then having a pre-meeting, does that solve the problem? Because it's still going to happen in the meeting, the new information comes in.
It doesn't solve it because there's continually information coming in. So like Laboratory results are only one part of it. You've still got the clinicians who are not involved in the pre-meeting, and they're coming usually to impart lots of new information that we haven't heard before. So we're still having to go through effectively the same process of analysing the results and coming to a conclusion based on the whole picture.
Because could it be that the people who want the pre-meeting somehow misunderstand what an IMT is doing?
I do think that's the case. I mean, like I say, I've been chairing IMTs for a long time, and they're a bit like what we call a MDT, a clinical MDT, a clinical multidisciplinary team meeting, where it will be led by a clinician for a service. You will have microbiologists, maybe physiotherapists, psychologists. Each person is coming with their own information to impart to the clinician leading it. They're taking all that information and they're making a decision and a treatment plan for the patient. And an IMT is very similar to that. And I think some of the executives struggled with that concept because they're not accustomed to clinical MDTs. They're much more accustomed to maybe more business type style meetings, more corporate style meetings. And I've attended some of those myself in my new role, and pre-meetings do occur. They are something that occurs to run the agenda, decide who's going to speak about what, who's presenting what, that kind of thing. And in that setting, I think they can be very effective. But we are working in a very fast-paced clinical environment with very busy clinicians, and we don't have the same time. And the function of our IMT is not the same as a business type meeting.
So what I'd like to do now is trying to keep the is trying to think about the issue that you raise, which is that there is some sort of challenge to you about epidemiology. If you go to back to your statement, which is paragraph 803. I haven't noted the page number down. It is 259. You describe a particular problem with the IMTs at this point. You didn't find them to be very efficient.
Yes.
And you were spending time going over minutes, going back over hypotheses, and challenge about epidemiology. What is it about these IMTs that you think is the cause or causes for these changes that you're describing in this paragraph, compared to, say, the earlier part of 2018?
Again, I felt that this is more about the reputation of the organisation rather than trying to get to the root of the problem. I felt that the epidemiology was being interpreted with that in mind, to say that there wasn't a problem. For me, I felt there were reasons that there had been some changes in the epidemiology, particularly around all the work that had been done on gram-positive infections. We had managed to bring those down, but we were still seeing, in my view, an excess number of gram-negative infections. But not just that, but it was the diversity of the organisms again, which are very much in conjunction with that definition I gave you earlier of an opportunistic premise plumbing pathogen. So within that definition, there are the classic waterborne organisms that we've mentioned, but also within that definition are organisms that can sometimes be considered to be found in the gut, so Enterobacter and Klebsiella, but are also implicated in water outbreaks and are also part of that opportunistic premise plumbing pathogen definition. And that was a point that I felt was not being accepted. I felt that the focus on these organisms was that they could only be from the gut and they could only be a result of gut translocation as opposed to coming from the environment.
We had some evidence from Dr. Kennedy, and I mean, cutting it very, very short, he was quite adamant. I think he said 2 or 3 times to me that he wouldn't want his view to be interpreted as there wasn't a problem.
Yes.
He felt he was saying that actually there was it was a more complex point that he's making.
Yes.
Would you accept that in respect to Dr. Kennedy's analysis?
I think at the time, so he said that now, but at the time his analysis was being referred to by senior members of the organisation as being definitive. And I don't recall him expressing the opinion at the time.
But it wasn't definitive.
Uh-huh.
Right. I wonder at this point whether it would have been a good idea to carry out that bringing together of the epidemiology work that you'd not done the previous October.
Yes.
Why didn't that happen?
I think by that time, I think HPS by this time maybe were looking at producing a report. And then I resigned. So that epidemiology would have had to be updated to give it any value. So having Ian Kennedy's report is one thing, but I would have also needed Kathleen Harvey-Wood and Dr. Peters to produce an extension of their work. And I would have needed Health Protection Scotland to produce an extension of theirs before I would be in a position to bring that all together.
Because the narrative that Dr. Kennedy sets out, I think, is that at the meeting on the 14th of September, or if not at that meeting, quite close to it, he is asking you to present his 2019 report to the IMT. Do you recollect that happening?
Sorry, the 14th of September, I wasn't.
Sorry, the 14th of August, my mistake.
14th of August. I don't recall that.
So the essence I got is that in the days or weeks before your replacement as IMT chair, he's asking you to have his report presented. Do you recollect that?
I can't recall that, no.
I want to just check when you received a particular report, which is an HPS report. It's Bundle 7, Document 5, page 194. Now, the version we have is recorded at the bottom. It's called Situational Awareness, Wards 2A, 2B, Royal Hospital for Children, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And the bottom of the page declared to be version 1, June 2019. But we've had evidence from Dr. Imrie and from Dr. Kennedy that this version was shared with version of this was shared with the Health Board early in 2019. Dr. Imrie said it was January. Dr. Kennedy didn't give a date, and he had checked it. He'd been part of the checking group.
Yes.
And if we go through to Appendix 4, which is page 205, we have a little epidemiology report. Now, what I'm wanting to and if we go through 4 pages and stop there, we will see the graphs rate to go back to a date in 2013. I think it's June 2013, and they go forward to a date in late 2018. And if we go back 3 pages, we'll see it written down. But the reason I'm asking about this is, when did you see this report for the first time? Go back to 205, please.
If there was an earlier draft that Ian Kennedy would have seen, I would have seen it around the same time, I would imagine. I would have been in the distribution, but I can't be more specific than that.
The reason I'm asking is because, as you say, it does seem to be the case from the way I think Dr. Kennedy expressed it, that yes, his report is ultimately seen to be important by some people.
Yes.
This report doesn't seem to attract the same attention, although its later version does. And I just wondered why it is that, in a sense, you're not also looking at this at the time. Because basically, the first few meetings before you're removed, you're not talking about epidemiology in the way they talk about it afterwards. And I wonder why there's that change.
I don't know. I can't recall.
Because there's epidemiology evidence available, albeit this is for the previous year.
Yes.
And Dr. Kennedy's evidence is taking his work slightly further forward in time. Do you recollect that his report goes on into 2019?
Yes.
And I just wonder why it is that in those early, I suppose now it's about 6 weeks before you cease to be the chair of the IMT, you're not looking at epidemiology as a source of relevant information, enhancing of whether there's a connection to the event.
Well, I think this report was done in 2018, so
It was, yes.
wouldn't be relevant to what we were looking at the time. Like, we
Okay.
would need to be updated with the most recent.
What about Dr. Kennedy's
information.
report? Because that was updated.
Yes, that was updated.
I'll take this off the screen. So would you have, why weren't you talking about Dr. Kennedy's work in the IMT?
I don't recall the date I received it from Dr. Kennedy. There was, what I do remember about that time is I went on annual leave at the beginning of July, and I had an extension to that because a relative was ill. So there was a big 3 week, almost 4 week period with no IMT between the end of July and the beginning of August, which may have been a factor and may have meant that I didn't get time to read it, but I don't know for sure.
So yes, because there's an IMT on the 3rd of July and one on the 1st of August.
Yes, there was a significant gap at one point.
Now, in your statement at page 260, so that's the next page, in paragraph 806, you make the quite significant allegation that I could not raise the issue with an IMT with Sandra Devine and Jennifer Armstrong as they were opposed to what I was doing. They did not want the infections to be investigated as incident or outbreak. They were the people challenging me, so I didn't really have anywhere to go. And then you describe who was supporting you. Now, I appreciate that if they were the people who were challenging you, you wouldn't have anywhere else to go. I get that. But it's quite a significant allegation to suggest that the medical director and the health hospital-acquired infection lead and the ICM manager didn't want these matters investigated as an outbreak. What's your basis for that?
The basis for that is a meeting that I had in June.
Was this on the 24th of June?
With both individuals,
yes.
When we were talking about the epidemiology, and Jennifer Armstrong referred to me as a lone voice. She said that I was out on a limb, that I wasn't asking for expert input early enough. And we had some conversations around the epidemiology where she asked me quite a lot of questions about the epidemiology, and I gave her my view, again, focusing on the nature of the bacteria, the diversity of the bacteria, explaining about the gram-positive organisms being reduced through the CLABSI work. The content of that meeting was then relayed back to the IMT by Christine, in the sense that I got exactly the same questions that I'd had from Dr. Armstrong from Christine in the IMT.
He insists there's no connection at all.
Very similar questions. I would imagine he would have been briefed, but perhaps
he
not.
denies he was briefed. He says he just looked at the minutes and thought of the questions himself.
Well, very similar questions from another senior director, such that at the end of it, one of the clinicians said to me, "You are under a firing squad." That's how it felt. So there were definite challenges coming to me from the epidemiology. In addition to that, there was a meeting that I went to with Sandra Devine and Pamela Janidis, where they told me that the issue was not related to the water, but that it was gut translocation, which I've described already. And I didn't share that view.
So we go back to paragraph 801 on the previous page. I want to ask you, I think I'll need to put this to Dr. Armstrong when she gives evidence next week. Do you see in the third line, you've reported her view was that there was a background rate that would be acceptable.
Yes.
She was very focused on that and was very focused on benchmarking with other hospitals. Are you getting views from other hospitals around the country as to what their bacteria rates were? Now, there's a lot in there. I'm going to ask her about this. I want to understand a bit more about what you think she was trying to say, or what she actually said, what she might have done. Is there a background rate, firstly, for these gram-negative bacteria you were seeing in early June 2019 that is acceptable?
So for certain organisms, so obviously these patients are very vulnerable, and there are what we would describe as endogenous flora, which is the patient's own flora, and exogenous, which is acquired externally. And even with the best efforts, these patients on occasions will acquire infection. often from their own gut flora, things like E. coli. So there will be, to a certain extent, and we expect to see, and this is backed up by epidemiological studies, patients, E. coli is one of the most common causes of bacteremia in this patient group. But the problem is, and it's going back to the type of bacteria and the diversity of the bacteria and the fact they're exogenous, acquired from an environmental source, you would not be expecting to see a background rate, certainly not of Cupriavidis, Commomonas, Delphtia. There's no background rate of these organisms. We don't see these organisms in the laboratory in clinical samples.
So the second thing is,
Well, are you leaving the idea of background rate?
well, I'm wondering, we've heard from Miss Harvey-Wood about something to do with background rate, but why would you say there's no background rate for these organisms?
Because we don't expect patients to carry them endogenously. We expect them to come from an environmental source. And as an infection control practitioner, these are what we would term preventable infections. We shouldn't be expecting to see these. We should have appropriate control over the environment and water systems such that these should not be occurring and giving a background rate. They're not what I would call endemic. So endemic is low levels of an organism all the time, such as E. coli. But you would not expect for these unusual waterborne organisms for there to be an endemic or background rate because they are so unusual.
Might there be a background rate within the water system as opposed to within the patients?
Yes, so I think that's an important distinction. When we say these organisms are uncommon, what we mean is they're not common in clinical samples, but in the environment they're what we call ubiquitous, so they can be found in the water and the soil. And if you go looking for them, you may find them. The issue with this hospital is that the levels were significantly high enough to represent a risk to immunosuppressed children.
And so when you identify, I think it would help us if you gave us a complete list of the bacteria that you, for example, if you go to bundle 6, page, I'll find the better list actually, which is a page 121, which is the appendix of Dr. Kennedy's report. And so he tells us that this list was provided to you by you in 2018.
Correct.
And firstly, he then uses that as the list for both his 2018-2019 work. Were you aware of that?
That's correct, yeah.
Would any, I mean, I slightly pulled him up on this, but would any distinction, would it matter that the 2019 work was used in the 2018 list? Would that affect the validity of what he's done?
Well, there are so many different environmental organisms. We would need to be checking that we haven't seen any new or additional ones in the patient groups affected.
And that would involve checking that actually, as it were, the list from the IMTs.
Yes.
And are you able to tell us whether this list misses out anything that appeared in 2019?
I would need to check.
But is it effectively we just check what's listed in the IMTs? Is that going to really be enough?
Yes, if we're just focusing on these environmental gram-negative organisms, yes.
But looking at this list, which of these organisms that were an issue in 2018 and form the basis of his work in 2019, would you say there is no background rate in the patients in clinical samples?
Okay, so the first one, Achromobacter.
And what's helpful if you do for the first time is you give me an explanation of why you say that.
Because it's a rare and unusual gram-negative organism that we don't see in clinical samples.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to have it would be effectively that's going to be a case for a lot of these you're going to mention.
Yes.
Well, in a sense, don't say it's for the same reason when we go to it, but it's a different reason for any of them. Please do explain what the reason is. So for the next one, the Acinetobacters, both of them, are they ones where you would expect a background rate in clinical samples of these patients?
Acinetobacter is obviously slightly different. It's not just waterborne, it's often found in dust.
You explained that yesterday,
It's one of the more common environmental organisms that we see, but I would still be concerned to see that. So I wouldn't suggest that there should be a background rate. If there was any level of Acinetobacter, I would be looking for an environmental source. But it is slightly more common than the others on the list.
I can't pronounce the next one, but the next one, would that be
Brevandomonas, no background rate.
for the same reasons as the first one?
Correct.
Burkholderia?
Burkholderia cepacia, there would be a background rate in one particular patient population, and that is cystic fibrosis, and that is because it is a lung condition characterised by biofilms, and with time, patients will become colonised with these resistant bacteria that form biofilms. So in cystic fibrosis, yes, there will be a background rate.
And would there be in any other patient group?
No.
No. Sedecia. I'm going to say it's you to pronounce them because I'm going to get it wrong.
Really the whole section down to Enterobacter, so including Elizabeth Kingia, for all of those there would be no background rate.
For the same reason?
Yeah.
Right. What about Klebsiella pneumoniae?
So Enterobacter and Klebsiella pneumonia are interesting in that they are found in the human gut, and that can make interpretation difficult. So there may well be a background rate of those.
Right.
However, they are also opportunistic premise plumbing pathogens and can be implicated in water system outbreaks. And that can make those organisms, it can be quite difficult to tease out what's going on with those. But certainly if there was an increase above your normal background rate, you might expect an environmental source.
But that would have to be the normal background for those two?
Yes.
Right. On to the next column.
Morganella is potentially one that you would have a background rate for. It's a less common gut organism.
Similar issues with Enterobacter and Klebsiella?
Yeah.
Right. Please work your way down the list.
So all the way down, none of the rest.
So all the rest would be no background rate?
Yes.
Okay.
I rather fear that I'm being very slow here. Could you offer me a definition of what a background rate is?
What you would normally expect for that patient population, taking into account the high-risk nature of the group, their vulnerability to infection and the likely sources of infection. So we would normally expect to see background rates of organisms like E. coli, streptococci that are found in the mouth. And that's because when these patients get chemotherapy, their mouth and their gut gets inflamed and the bacteria cross the barrier into the bloodstream. So you will see a background rate in that patient group for those bacteria.
Is the absence of a background rate in some way different from it is just so rarely encountered that you regard it as a isolated event as opposed to part of a number of events? I'm struggling with this, I have to confess.
Yeah, I mean, there are some bacteria on this list that I'd never seen before.
Well, is that what, if you come across a bacteria which you, in your extensive experience, have not come across before, you conclude, well, there's no, because is it because it is so unusual that there is no background?
Yes.
Lloyd, can I just chuck in a question for the moment? What do you think?
Yeah, yes. Certainly if you've picked up my difficulty, because I do understand that some sort of infections are encountered more commonly, some are less commonly, and some are perhaps so infrequent as to
Yes.
be absolutely on the edge of the spectrum. But I certainly have a layman's expectation that if you looked at a long enough period in a large enough population, even rare events will occur from time to time. And therefore, even rare events, in that sense, have a background rate. But I may be not understanding the point. The short answer may be that if infections are very rare, they don't have a background rate because they're random as opposed to part of a pattern?
So that was what I was going on. Two things. One is, I'll put out both and see what you comment on them. So one is the point his lordship's making, which is, if something's random because it happens so infrequently that you're just not used to it, it's just one of these things that happens. It might be in a sense clinically acceptable because it's in the old days might be referred to as an act of God. It's so rare that it just happens for no reason. And therefore, the existence of a very rare thing once or twice in a decade might not be remarkable enough to require action. So that's one possible way of seeing it. And the other idea comes in a different direction, is when you say background rate, do you mean a background rate which doesn't cause me anxiety about whether I can do something about it?
Yes.
So that's the answer to the second question.
The first question, you're correct. So these environmental organisms are what we call ubiquitous in the environment. So seeing a single case of, say, for example, Delphtia acidivorans, people might just think that's just chance. There's lots of different environmental sources and not respond to that. But the situation we had is we didn't have just one of these. We had many of these on the list over a defined period of time, and then we find these organisms in the water. So we were not just responding to a single rare case of a bacteria. We were responding to many cases of rare bacteria.
I think in order to finish this section about the meeting with you and Dr. Armstrong and Sandra, I need to ask one more question. You've described in your statement that she was looking for getting other hospitals from around the country.
Yes.
Did she ever discuss which hospitals might be appropriate comparators in that meeting?
I don't believe so, but I think at the IMT I suggested Great Ormond Street.
Did she ever discuss the possibility of comparing with hospitals within Glasgow?
No, there wouldn't have been a hospital comparable within Glasgow.
Why not?
Because no other hospitals had these patients at the time, unless she was referring to the Old York Hill.
Thank you. I've got no more questions for the morning. I'll have to after lunch.
We'll take our lunch break now, and I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Please stand.